All right, so hi, this is Dr. Stoes, and today we're going to be talking about some new trends in treatment for psychological conditions, some of the trends that are just being tested in hospitals, not yet fully supported by DSM-5 and by other agencies. But let's talk about what's been happening with psychedelics. And so, for instance, various psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin, sometimes MDMA, ecstasy, as well as ketamine are being tested in various labs across the US and actually also in Western Europe. So for instance, in the United States at UCLA, they're testing clients who are facing cancer diagnoses. New York University, same kind of dynamic. Johns Hopkins is testing a number of different conditions: depression, anxiety, OCD, and University of New Mexico is also testing some of these drugs as well. Most of the drugs are still banned by the US government, in particular LSD and psilocybin, because they believed from what happened in the 1960s that the drugs had no potential to help psychological conditions. However, we're discovering that's not true. So the research now being done, and especially that which has been done from 2006 until the present, shows that the psychedelic substances can be beneficial, especially for particular kinds of conditions. That would be treatment-resistant depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and those who have addictions to smoking as well as alcohol. We would not at all recommend psychedelics for use with people who are psychotic or schizophrenic. So, nonetheless, within those limits, let's talk about what's going on. The testing that's being done in labs, research labs, indicates that the psychedelic substances can help us change some of our destructive habits of thought. And why? Because these substances help our brains make new neural connections and develop new neural pathways. So for instance, when we've looked at neuroimaging of the brains that are processing psychedelic drugs, we find that there's a shift in the network in our brain called the default mode network, or DMN for short. And the DMN, under the influence of these substances, starts to make different connections than usual. Normally, the DMN is very much concerned with our ego, ourself. And when we're thinking about ourselves, we're usually thinking about the past and the future. It's hard for us to stay in the present moment. But with psychedelic drugs, the default network goes quiet and we're able to remain in the present moments. And so, for instance, drugs like psilocybin, sometimes popularly known as magic mushrooms, can help us become a little bit more flexible or plastic with our thinking. So, we've already mentioned some of the problems that have been helped by the use of psychedelic substances. There's been a fair amount of research now done on addictions, in particular smoking and alcohol addictions. And we've mentioned the treatment-resistant depression, also the anxiety and depression that people experience when they're given a diagnosis of cancer and possibly also a terminal diagnosis with the cancer. So I'm going to describe some of these studies in a lot more detail in the next few slides. So for instance, at Johns Hopkins, their labs are using psilocybin, the magic mushrooms, to treat smoking addictions, and guess what? 80% success rate. Also, Johns Hopkins has been looking at psilocybin with cancer patients and helping them cope with some of their existential distress. So for instance, the results indicate that a lot of their negative emotional reactions are reduced, if not eliminated. Past research, when you look back at the meta-analyses that happened in the 50s, 60s, so there was a lot of research going on with LSD in the decade and a half that the substances were supported by the government with research. They did have some fairly good success rates. And so more recently, folks have gone back, looked at all the good data from that era, and then tried to pull it together with a meta-analysis. So they found, for instance, that LSD could be helpful, 70% success rate with anxiety, 62% success rate with depression, OCD, 42% success rate. And also in Canada, there was government funding for using LSD to treat alcoholism. And same story, success rate was pretty positive. When people had finished with their experience, their psychedelic trip, if you will, they've reported feeling more of a connection with other people, like family members, and that helped them to stop their addictive habits because they didn't want to hurt members of their family.